Just as China announced the upcoming visit of two top EU officials, Ursula von der Leyen, President of the European Commission, and Charles Michel, President of the European Council, for July 24-26, there was no red carpet welcome. Instead, Beijing delivered a sharp rebuke to the EU. Von der Leyen likely anticipated her visit would open doors for economic cooperation, but she was met with a cold reception before even landing. The Ministry of Commerce preemptively unveiled a list of countermeasures, delivered with frank and unambiguous language. This move landed a significant blow, transforming what might have been a cordial visit into a tense diplomatic showdown. The shift in tone was evident from the start. On July 21, during the Ministry of Foreign Affairs regular press conference, a spokesperson announced the EU leaders' visit to commemorate the 50th anniversary of China-EU diplomatic relations. This should have been a moment of goodwill, a ceremonial recognition of a long-standing relationship. However, what truly captured attention was a simultaneous press conference just minutes before. In the Ministry of Commerce's press briefing room, spokesperson He Yong declared China would retaliate against the EU's impending new round of sanctions. The countermeasures would focus on European financial institutions' operations in China, import permits for certain brandy products, and annual reviews for European-funded companies in port logistics. In essence, you sanction, we retaliate. This direct approach was no coincidence. It was a deliberate, synchronized move by Beijing. It sent a clear signal: you are welcome to visit, but not if you bring harmful intentions. Ironically, the EU itself provided China with the justification for this strong response. Just 2 days before the visit announcement, the European Commission finalized its 18th round of trade sanctions against China, primarily targeting high-end manufacturing and export rebate companies. The EU accused China of opaque subsidies and excessive financial assistance. In other words, the EU was simultaneously taking a moral high ground while sending its top officials to seek cooperation, a move perceived in China as duplicity. Guo Jiaqin emphasized China's firm opposition to Europe's recent sanctions against Chinese companies and banks. He stated that the EU's actions lacked basis in international law and UN-Security Council authorization, deeming them typical, illegal unilateral sanctions. China warned the EU to immediately cease actions harming China's legitimate interests, vowing to retaliate to defend its enterprises. As of July 2025, Europe is grappling with persistent inflation, industrial outflow, and slow progress in energy transition. Across the Atlantic, Donald Trump's aggressive tariff policies are once again reshaping the global economic landscape. Amidst Trump's threat of a 15% tariff on European electric vehicles, von der Leyen swiftly announced her visit to China, leading a high-level EU delegation. This move was widely interpreted as the EU's attempt to pressure the US while simultaneously safeguarding its interests in China. However, China did not immediately extend a warm welcome to this sudden display of enthusiasm. Instead, Beijing maintained a highly restrained and professional approach. Every step, from diplomatic arrangements to agenda setting, reflected rationality and adherence to principles. Von der Leyen's primary objective was to alleviate the pressure on European industries from Trump's tariffs and to leverage market cooperation with China to find a buffer for European economic growth. Yet, the EU's real issues extend far beyond merely mending relations. In recent years, the EU's frequent imposition of sanctions, tariffs, and technical reviews on China has eroded mutual trust, especially in critical industrial chains like semiconductors and green energy. The EU has repeatedly invoked de-risking, a motive China understands clearly. Therefore, when arranging the talks, China showed no superficial eagerness. Instead, through a meticulous and orderly agenda, Beijing sent a clear message: cooperation is possible, but it must be based on equality and mutual respect. Any one-sided demands or unilateral pressure will not compromise China's core national interests. Symbolically, China did not characterize this visit as a major turning point, but rather as strategic communication. This nuanced phrasing reflects China's consistent maturity in international relations, refusing to be swayed by short-term maneuvers or to sacrifice principles for expediency. Concurrently, China has conveyed a clear trajectory of high-quality development through economic data and policy directions. China does not rely on any single export market, but instead expands its economic resilience through domestic demand, technological innovation, and regional cooperation. This undoubtedly set the boundaries for von der Leyen's discussions. Overall, the EU's urgent visit appears rushed and multifaceted in its intentions. In contrast, China, with a calm and resolute diplomatic rhythm, has demonstrated strong strategic confidence. For a diplomatic engagement initiated by the EU, but with the initiative firmly in China's hands, its strategic implications are far more significant than the immediate outcomes of the visit itself. When China and the European Economic Community established diplomatic relations in 1975, their combined GDP was approximately $1.47 trillion, close to the US GDP of around $1.69 trillion. By 2024, the US GDP had reached about $30.51 trillion, and the gap between China and the US had widened significantly compared to 1975. Metaphorically, if the global economy is a race with 3 lanes, the US is leading, the EU is in the middle, and China is trailing. The most uncomfortable, anxious, and stressed runner is undoubtedly the one in the middle. This aptly describes the EU's current mindset. This year marks the 50th anniversary of China-EU diplomatic relations, a time typically for celebration. However, Europe appears preoccupied, often viewing China with a degree of hostility. This uncertainty is a key factor in current China-EU relations. In 1975, Europe demonstrated strategic foresight, with leaders understanding that building relations with a rising China served Europe's long-term interests. At that time, Europe ambitiously aimed to stand alongside the US as a major global power. 50 years later, the EU finds itself in a strategic confusion. The fundamental difference lies in vision. For years, the EU has expended significant energy scrutinizing China, its peer, while remaining at a loss on how to catch up with the US, which is ahead. Europe's focus has been on China's role in conflicts, even blaming China for creating them. For instance, the daily influx of over 1,500 Chinese electric vehicles into Europe is a point of concern. When the EU believes its security lies in pushing its sphere of influence to Russia's border and views Russia as an enemy to be defeated, it becomes increasingly difficult for them to accept China's neutral policy. In the midst of major geopolitical shifts, why has Europe's vision become increasingly myopic and narrow? A March report from the Global Affairs Institute, titled "Goodbye, West: Global Pluralism in the Trump Era," suggests that a second Trump term is leading to the demise of the West as a geopolitical concept due to the irreversible breakdown of relations between the US and its traditional allies. The report argues that moving beyond a West versus the rest mindset would benefit global order because the concept of the West carries colonial connotations for most of the world. The future, it posits, will transition to a global pluralistic order without a single hegemon, based instead on multi-regional and multi-civilizational cooperation. Viewing China-EU relations through this lens broadens perspective. When issues like rare earths, technology transfer, and market access are repeatedly discussed in Brussels, the EU needs to understand that China, in matters of trade barriers and tariffs, is not just defending its own interests, but also asserting its voice in international order and trade rules. While these specific trade frictions can be resolved through mutually beneficial, pragmatic negotiations between China and the EU, changes in the international order require greater coordination between these two important pillars of the world system. Some Western scholars caution the EU that China might exploit EU contradictions to draw Europe closer while isolating the US. Whether EU policymakers harbor such concerns is unclear, given the long-standing brotherly relationship between Europe and the US. However, What is more crucial for EU policymakers to consider is that this very mindset prevents the EU from broadening its strategic vision. The US uses tariffs to batter the WTO system, harming both China and the EU. But from China's perspective, this is not merely a matter of more or less buying and selling, it's a strategic issue concerning the future of the global order. Without a stable trade system where both China and the EU have a voice, or more broadly, a system where all nations operate on an equal footing to set rules, rather than revolving around American hegemonic interests, no one will thrive. If this point is understood, China-EU issues become about how to collaboratively promote WTO reform, jointly formulate new rules for digital trade, and work together on pressing issues like emission reduction. Grasping this will foster internal unity within the EU, build consensus, deepen reforms, and ultimately enhance the EU's position in global politics and economics. Understanding this will allow the EU to shed its burdens, broaden its perspective, and clearly see that the world is entering a historical moment of ensuring fairer and more reasonable global rules. China's rare earth exports to the United States surged sixfold last month, demonstrating the success of its rare earth strategy in establishing leverage and beginning to strategically divide the American rare earth industry. Recently, President Donald Trump has been busy scrambling to secure rare earths globally. From forced acquisitions of mineral resources and signing mineral development agreements to secretly engaging in rare earth development with Southeast Asian, Latin American, and Australian partners, Trump even hosted leaders from 5 African nations, Gabon, Guinea-Bissau, Liberia, Mauritania, and Senegal, at the White House recently. Despite struggling with their names, Trump loudly declared them allies, primarily to develop Africa's mineral resources. The Pentagon also announced plans to invest billions of dollars in US domestic rare earth producers to develop rare earth magnets. After months of this intense diplomatic and financial effort by the Trump administration, amounting to tens of billions in rare earth investments, news from China caused a stir. It was opening up rare earth exports to the US. On July 20th, data released by China's General Administration of Customs drew global attention. Rare earth magnet exports to the US in June soared to 353 tons, a 660% month-on-month increase, representing an explosive growth. What does this mean from China? Just as the US was in a frenzy, China suddenly unleashed a flood of rare earth exports. This puts existing US rare earth initiatives in an awkward position. With China's rare earth supply available, American companies will naturally have less incentive to pursue their own initiatives. China has subtly diffused Trump's half-year effort to de-risk the rare earth supply chain. However, seriously, this surge in China's rare earth exports to the US does not mean an end to export restrictions. On the contrary, China's exports are targeted, and restrictions are also precise. It's like China offering a carrot to the US. China's strategy is quite sophisticated. First, while the six-fold increase in China's rare earth exports to the US seems significant at first glance, it's because China's rare earth exports to the US had been almost zero in previous months. In May, exports to the US were only a few dozen tons. Second, the surge in exports is specifically for rare earth magnets, which are relatively less critical and easier to extract and produce compared to other rare earths. Other rare earths classified as dual-use items, which cannot be exported to the US military, remain under strict control, leaving no loopholes for the US. Third, China cannot completely prohibit rare earth exports. Just as the US's comprehensive technological blockade of China only accelerates China's independent research and development, a complete rare earth blockade against the US and the West would not only prevent the utilization of resources and inhibit overseas revenue generation, but more importantly, would solidify the West's resolve to develop its own rare earth resources, which would be detrimental to China's rare earth monopoly. Therefore, the current approach is optimal. On one hand, strict rare earth export approval procedures ensure China has clear information on buyers for every kilogram of rare earth exported. Previously, there were reports of the US bypassing China's controls by crude processing rare earths in third-party countries like Mexico and Thailand, then relabeling them as handicrafts for large-scale smuggling into the US. However, the smuggling route has now been blocked by China, which recently increased enforcement, cracking down on illegal export cases and apprehending suspects, strictly preventing controlled materials from being illegally used in military applications. This makes China's rare earth control strategy more precise. A moderate relaxation for civilian use ensures the production of American civilian products and prevents excess from flowing to unapproved entities. China can flexibly counteract the US, ensuring the US cannot obtain sufficient rare earths and must continue to seek cooperation with China. Of course, the US has not abandoned its own development efforts. In July, projects like the one in Namazoo on the Huihe River launched its first new rare earth mine in 70 years. American rare earth development companies claim the mining area holds 1.7 million tons of rare earth oxides. The US government also provided $400 million in subsidies to domestic companies, attempting to reconstruct the supply chain. In fact, since 2010, Boston-based private equity firms have been investing in a mining company called Serra Verde, which extracts heavy rare earths in Brazil. After 14 years of effort and an additional $150 million investment from the US and UK, the company's mine near Minas in Goiás State, Brazil, finally opened in 2024. The US government-controlled US International Development Finance Corporation quietly stated last month that it intends to fund the expansion of the Serra Verde mine project. However, the New York Times pointed out a hurdle for the US government's investment. The mine has already signed a contract with a Chinese company to sell its rare earth resources to China. Serra Verde CEO Thais Murray stated that they are the only customer capable of processing these products, acknowledging that China's decades of foresight have given them a strong advantage. Murray did not disclose specific contract details, but stated that the vast majority of the company's products would be sold to China till at least 2027. Murray also told the New York Times that after China announced rare earth export controls, many Western governments and industry representatives tried to contact his company, hoping to obtain rare earths mined in Brazil. However, Murray stated that these rare earths would still be shipped to China. He expressed admiration for China's achievements and acknowledged the difficulty of competing with them. Rare earths are divided into light rare earths and heavy rare earths. China primarily has light rare earths, which are crucial raw materials for new energy vehicles, wind power equipment, and nickel metal hydride batteries. Heavy rare earths, however, are indispensable in military manufacturing. China has limited heavy rare earth reserves and therefore procures them from abroad. Compared to Myanmar's rare earths, Brazilian rare earths are of higher quality and have lower purification costs. Since the Serra Verde mine in Goiás State, Brazil, began production, China imported 419 tons of rare earths from Brazil in the first quarter of 2025 for military manufacturing. Rare earth mining often produces large quantities of radioactive waste and heavy metals, causing pollution. Importing rare earths avoids the need to process radioactive materials, leaving the responsibility and significant costs of handling radioactive substances to the extracting country. For example, in China's Lamnan mining area in Jiangxi, every ton of rare earth extracted requires the disposal of 5 tons of radioactive tailings. To prevent pollution, companies incur significant costs to treat pollutants. China's direct import of rare earths from other countries is relatively more convenient. The EU has introduced a Critical Raw Materials Act, establishing a green certification for rare earths. China's approach is to directly import these green-certified rare earths from them, process them, and then re-export them, perfectly meeting the requirements and avoiding European and American tariffs. Finally, it's worth noting the Brazil mines, China refines model. China's greatest advantage in the rare earth sector is not its mining volume or reserves, but its processing technology. 90% of the world's rare earth separation capacity is concentrated in China. Brazil, despite being a major rare earth reserve holder, is at least 10 years behind China in rare earth refining technology. This applies not only to Brazil, but also to Australia, Myanmar, and the United States. Their rare earth processing technologies are far behind China's. The rare earths often need to be shipped to China for processing before flowing into the global market. The warming of trade relations and the progress of Trump's visit to China indicate a period of fragile détente in US-China relations. The two countries are shifting from mutual strangulation to exchanging bargaining chips, reflecting a realistic logic of contend but do not break amidst deeply intertwined global supply chains. However, deeper struggles continue. China, using rare earths as leverage, is legalizing export controls, transforming its resource advantage into international rule-making power. The US, meanwhile, uses technology as a shield, exchanging chip relaxations for supply chain breathing room, buying time for domestic alternatives. If Trump visits China as scheduled, the two sides may sign a phased trade agreement, but the long-term struggle will ultimately return to the core issue. Whoever can first break through choke point technologies will escape the cycle of passive compromise. Rare earths are never just earth. They are also a crucial chess piece in the grand game of great powers. As container ships from Chinese ports sail across the Pacific, and as Trump's special plane plans its route to Beijing, this world-shaping strategic game is quietly rewriting the rules in data and diplomatic rhetoric.